So there's a huge gap between this blue sky potential and reality. Why is that? Well, clearly there's a lack of a carbon compliance scheme. But I would also notice where there has been a carbon compliance scheme, such as in New South Wales, that did not lead to a great big carbon rush because the carbon price was relatively low, and there are things like carbon compliance costs. The second reason is voluntary markets actually do exist and will continue to exist, but without a carbon price, without a formal compliance scheme, there is a carbon market. But the problem with that is there have been so many rule changes that you cannot invest. So when they kill the greenhouse-friendly scheme, of course, it kills investment. And in fact, you cannot legally supply the domestic market. The other thing is that's very important to understand is the nature of a carbon forestry investment. It's a very large initial capex, which is very significant compared to running the running cost of the assets. The returns occur over decades. And the best way of thinking about it as an asset class is environmental infrastructure. It actually has very similar investment characteristics to a power station. High upfront capital cost, low O&M cost, and you actually get the monetisation of that in the case of an electricity plant as you sell the electrons to the market, in the case of a carbon sink forest as you sell the units into the market. The key thing in my view about this is the debate entirely lacks any form of microeconomics. We have no microeconomic assessment. Let me give you an example. Here's a part of an ABARES study. These were the cost assumptions for timber plantings and environmental plantings. And you can see, though, there's no management, no harvesting and no transport costs. But actually, a microeconomic analysis would tell you there actually is a large amount of management costs. Fire suppression, weed control, feral animal control. I can assure you of that because I keep on writing the authorisations in the company for these things every month, and it hurts. The second thing, you don't have harvesting, but you have scheme compliance, you have carbon inventory, you have audit, and you have to deal with risk premium issues often greater than 5%. So if we can't understand some of the microeconomics, it's not surprising we get the macroeconomics not quite right. Another example, and perhaps in my mind, one of the most significant one that's overlooked, is the issue of technical risk. This is a list of technical risks that I identified off the top of my head last Sunday. I don't pretend that it's complete, but I can assure you that each of those technical risks actually have a real commercial impact if you get them wrong. Again, I'd leave that there not so much because I think I've got it all, but I just want to indicate to you that all of this blue sky potential that you see in the large-scale macro reports don't ever deal with these technical risks. The reality is we do not know what to plant and where to plant most species across most of the landscape. To commercialise one species into a new landscape potentially is costing upwards of $1 million or so. So, the last set of comments I would make is in relation to regulation. There's a lot of talk about the carbon farming initiative. It's important to understand it's just a supply side measure. It does not do anything on the demand side. It does not create a market mechanism in terms of meeting demand. The second thing that's not understood about it, and actually why I like it, is it's technologically neutral. In other words, if you think soil carbon's going to work, you can put up a case and get a tick or a cross. If you think forestry with harvesting is going to work, you can put up a case and get a tick or a cross. If you think putting a bag over the head of a cow is going to work, you can put it up and get a tick or a cross. So it's actually a technologically neutral policy, which tends to be very alarming to Australia because we don't like technologically neutral policies by and large. The third thing is it actually does provide a platform for product creation within a consistent and comparable and transparent framework. In other words, it provides the important function of acting as a quality insurance mechanism for the market, but it does not provide any market itself. Now, the alternative to something like this is the market goes and develops it and self-regulates, and that would occur over time. It's occurred internationally, but it would slow up the process of things. The final comment really is there may or may not be a carbon price mechanism. The Carbon Farming Initiative is worth doing regardless of whether there's a formal carbon price, because it actually provides some supply side clarity. But the risk that you run is, having got a Carbon Farming Initiative through, someone says you shouldn't be able to put Carbon Farming Initiative credits into a compliance scheme. And this would be a very serious problem, because once there is a compliance market, voluntary markets do tend to fall away. But the other thing is, you are locking out from a compliance scheme the potential for cheap abatement. So you're taking a policy decision. If you don't allow CFI type credits into a compliance scheme or a tax scheme, whatever you call it, you are making a conscious decision effectively to drive up the cost of carbon. So I think the other thing about this whole area at the moment, the other major area of technical risk at present, is people know that there are going to be co-benefits with carbon farming, and there seems to be a great temptation to try and regulate for them. Let me give you an example. People like the idea of biodiverse carbon plantings, and so the risk is we are going to regulate against what are called monocultures. And if people are very, very determined, they might say, well, not only do we need biodiverse plantings, but we have to plant indigenous species, perhaps with local provenances, and that is the only thing that will qualify for our scheme. Now, this sort of thing could produce incredibly dangerous, perverse outcomes, because if you did that, what you would be designing at landscape scale is a system designed for failure. And it would fail because climate change is a reality, and the chance is, if you go for local provenances, you're designing a plantation that in 30 years will fail because it's no longer sitting in the right environment. Interestingly, if you don't try and regulate for that, but you ask the market and have an expectation on the market that you put in permanent plantings for 100 years, the nature of the risk changes. People then have to take that risk on board themselves. I could bet the market then begins to identify highly resilient, highly robust species that are likely to be more adaptive to climate change. So every time you see regulators trying to optimise a priori a particular landscape which is seen as being desirable, you're more likely, in my view, to produce landscapes which end up with very significant perverse outcomes or are quite undesirable. So there's my conclusion slide. There are very large differences between the theoretical potential and the on-ground reality, and there are a whole lot of reasons for that. There's an enormously poor understanding of cost structures and the microeconomic perspective in the literature. It's not surprising. However, I think that is a fertile area for future research. And finally, while the Carbon Farming Initiative is very welcome, we need to understand what it will do and what it won't do. And we need to be very, very careful of enthusiasm to regulate in a way that produces perverse outcomes. Thank you.